Hi, everybody. Good evening or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. I'm Yael. I'm managing Masa Tech at Masa. I'm very glad that you all joined us today for this webinar. There's still people joining us, but I want to be respectful for your time and for our speakers' time. So you're all here. All of you are candidates for Masa Tech for this super unique and prestigious program. We have here also Gregory and Ilya. We're both managing the program for English-speaking candidates and for non-English-speaking candidates. Some of you already know them. I will start by saying what probably is most interesting for you. We plan on starting the program in mid-October. This means that in about a month or so, we hope to relaunch our application and placement process. And once we lock an actual date in October, we'll obviously let you know and keep you in the loop. Until then, we're having these series of webinars to get you more familiar with this new market that you're about to join. So we're starting tonight with Inbal Halperin-Gottesman. Inbal is, sorry, I'm letting people join us while I'm speaking. Inbal manages the Jerusalem ecosystem at Startup Nation Central. She's one of Startup Nation Central's specialists to the Israeli ecosystem in general. So it's a great privilege that she's here with us tonight. So before I give the microphone to Inbal, I will say that if any of you have a question regarding Masa Tech, regarding the placement process, the logistics, feel free to email me. This webinar will not, we will not discuss the details of the program itself, but we'll talk about Israel's ecosystem as a whole. So if you have any question, feel free just to shoot me an email. I assume you all have my email, and you also have Gregory's and Ilya's emails. So we're here for that. And that's pretty much it. So Inbal, I think you are already assigned you as the co-host, so feel free to share your screen.
Thank you very much, Yael. So let me just share my presentation in 1 second. And actually, before I start, I would love if 2 or 3 participants would be willing to share, where are you from and what excites you about coming to Israel and working in the tech system, in the tech ecosystem. Unfortunately, we don't have time for everyone to share. So that's why I'm just asking, where are you from? Give me a taste of who I'm talking to.
I can speak.
Cool. Hey, Benjamin.
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm from Detroit, Michigan. I don't know. I've been to Israel a few times and really enjoyed it. Did like Birthright and stuff like that. And I'm kind of in the tech space here in Seattle, where I'm at now, and but also kind of open to moving around and whatnot. So, I love to travel and I love tech. I'm like data science kind of stuff. So, yeah.
Very cool. Seattle's a great place and a great tech hub too. Anyone else not from the US maybe?
Hey, my name is Rodrigo. I'm from Argentina. I work as a web dev for a US-based company. It's a translation company. I have been to Israel once with the Birthright program from Masa.
Mm-hmm.
And well, I loved it. And I thought this program would be a good first step to maybe in the future permanently move to Israel. So
amazing.
yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And do you have a degree already, or are you still studying?
Well, I'm doing my thesis here in Argentina. My engineering degree, it takes 5 years and a thesis, and I'm doing the thesis. I'm presenting it in 2 or 3 weeks, I think.
Okay, thank
So
you.
when the program starts, will already have it. Yeah.
Well, you're lucky it's getting postponed. You can finish your thesis in the meanwhile.
Yeah.
Thank
Super
you,
lucky.
Rodrigo. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Okay, anyone else? Last person that wants to share before I start?
I'll share. I'm from New York. I live in Chicago. I did Birthright in the older group this past winter. So I mean, you go in and you know they're going to try to get you to move it to Israel, and it still works. Like, that's how, in my opinion, like, that's how well it works, because you kind of know what you're getting into and it still works. And actually, I think everyone here probably has Jewish parents who are happy to have them moving to Israel. So my dad actually sent me the first kind of information about this program. And I am a data scientist and data analyst, so it just seemed like a really great fit. I was looking to move abroad anyway, so why not move to a place where I'd actually be fully welcome, you know? So that's kind of where I'm coming from, both parents and self-motivated.
Incredible. I think all Jewish parents are happy for you to move to Israel until you do it permanently. And then, you know, they don't see you as much as they wish to. And holidays. I am married to a Texan myself, and my dad made Aliyah almost 50 years ago from Chicago. So I know exactly, you know, how much the family abroad ends up missing you. Okay, so I'm going to start. Yael, I'm going to stop your screen sharing.
Go ahead.
Great. Did it work yet? I don't think it worked yet. No, I'm still on your screen. Okay, are you seeing my full screen? Incredible. So the group of people you see waving down there and that building over there is Startup Nation Central headquarters in Tel Aviv, just off Rothschild Avenue. And in normal days, that's where the organization that I work for conducts most of our business. So just to start and give you a frame of what we do, so Startup Nation Central, we're a nonprofit organization. As I said, our headquarters are in Tel Aviv, but I actually manage the Jerusalem ecosystem, which I will not talk about too much tonight. And if you have any questions about Jerusalem specifically, feel free to ask them in the Q&A later or reach out if you're really interested to learn more. And we're a nonprofit organization that aims to create bridges between the Israeli innovation and the ecosystem and the world. We believe many of the solutions to global problems, to big global problems, are developed here in Israel. And we want to help multinationals, corporations, governments, and NGOs get access to those types of innovation developed here and use them wherever they are around the world. And that's kind of how we measure ourselves as well. Our KPIs are economic KPIs, even though we don't charge for any of our activities. We measure ourselves by, was there an investment? Did that client become a customer? Did they decide to put a scout on the ground? Did they decide to build a presence or an R&D center here in Israel? So really our goal is to strengthen the Israeli ecosystem and the tech ecosystem here and enable connections to the world. So with that, I'm going to share today a few data points because we're also a data-driven organization. I'm going to talk about it later on, about Israel, about the tech ecosystem. Please submit your questions into either the chat box or save them for later. We'll have about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. And I'll try to do it quickly so we have enough time to talk. Okay, so as I said, this is me. I manage the Jerusalem ecosystem. And Israel is a pretty small country. We have a population of 9.1 million. which is, I believe, almost like Texas, even less than Texas, probably. And a workforce of 4.1 million. And the workforce is pretty small, and that's obviously we have children that are excluded out of that, and people over the age of 65 that are not counted here. But also there are huge populations in Israel that are actually underemployed. One of them is the ultra-Orthodox, which I'm sure all of you can imagine if you visited in Israel. So in the ultra-Orthodox communities, we see that most women, actually 90% of the women almost work. But when you look at men, much less employment. I would say probably only 60% of them work. And when you look at Arabs, you see almost a mirror picture of that. So almost all of the men work, not 90% like the ultra-Orthodox women, but around those numbers. And the women actually tend to stay at home and do more traditional raising of the family. Out of that, the high-tech workforce is only 7.6%, which is not that big. I mean, we make so much noise, but it's actually only 7.5% of the workforce in Israel. With that, we're also in charge, the high-tech, of 13% of the GDP and 33% of Israel's annual export. So even though it's a smaller population that's employed in the tech sector, it does have a huge impact on Israel economically. Now, every year there are all kinds of different rankings, and Israel, and one of them is actually the most famous one is the World Economic Forum that ranks by 37 different parameters. And what we see is that Israel comes number 6 in innovation, almost constantly over the last few years. We vary in different things. One example here, when people look at this and they're like, hey, what's with Switzerland there? And a lot of these rankings are around innovation in one specific sector. So Switzerland, for example, is really strong in the insurance tech. And that's one of the markets that they dominate and they hold a lot of patents in. And that's one of the measurements of how innovative you are. So moving forward, yes, a small country, a small market, but very dense. And if we look at the amount of startups that exist, there's one startup for every 1,400 people here in Israel. So the chances that you're gonna, live in Israel and know at least 1 or 2 people working in the tech sector is pretty substantial. We also see a pretty big diversity of innovation, and that's one of the things that Israel is most known for. Because if you look, we talked about Switzerland and having dominating one sector, but if you look at Israel, we really see innovation across the board in all kinds of different sectors. And one of the most interesting phenomena is that it's not only the diversity of fields, okay, so we have, mobile and cyber and automotive, but it's also people moving from one field to another with the same type of innovation. And one of my favorite stories is Zikit, which is a startup that was actually developed in the Army, identifying air pictures. So Tetzlumei Avir, am I saying air pic? I don't know, air photos, topography from the air, and they would map them and create a topographic map. And she took that same technology and applied it in fashion and actually allowed people to scan their body, upload an image of their body to the website and try on clothes online. And that's really, it sounds very different and very unique, but it's not a rare occasion where people actually move from different fields, also from the Army. Another great example is a startup that developed actually a way to look into walls. And they took that, again, in the Army, and they took that technology and allowed the same scanning to happen on the human body. So again, moving from a very, militarized innovation into the medical innovation. Israel also invests a lot of money in R&D, and that excludes any military R&D expenses. So this is only civilian R&D. So a lot of our GDP goes to this, goes to investing and building the innovation, trying out things. Some of it comes from the government, about 15 to 20%. We have, it's called the Israeli Innovation Authority. It used to be the chief scientist, but it changed its name. It's a government arm that helps to give seed investments without equity. So it's more like a loan that you then give back, or if you succeed, and if you don't, there are different terms for that. But actually 80% of that money that's coming into Israel is foreign money. And if we look at the investment that Israel attracts, the numbers are crazy. I mean, in 2019, there was a total of 8.3 billion invested in Israel. And that's like almost twice Canada. It's Canada and Brazil together. And per capita, it's one of the highest in the world today. And I'm continuing a little bit, and remember that number, 8.3 billion. We'll get back to that later when we talk a little bit about COVID-19 and how it affects the Israeli market. But if we look at investors in Israel, we see that most of them are actually foreign investors. So almost 80% of the money is coming from abroad. We have 33 countries investing in Israel. Obviously, the US is our biggest investor, and a lot of people are attracted to Israel because of the type of innovation that's happening here. UK, Germany, Japan, obviously from smaller countries that do investment, we see smaller numbers of investment. And if we look at the investor landscape, we really see, I know it looks like a lot of them are local and less foreign, but what we actually see that happens is a lot of foreign investors come to Israel, check the landscape, and decide to create a local presence here. So instead of them considered foreign investors, they're actually considered local investors now. And a lot of them see that as their access point into the Israeli market. And that's one of the most unique things, because as I said, Israel is a very small country. It's not really a market. And most of the times we see these types of presence happening in a market that's really huge, that's an access point. Again, we'll talk more about that later when we talk about exit strategies. So yeah, 85% of the funding is foreign. Actually, now we see that it's 80% during COVID time. That's why I said between 15 to 20%. Another interesting slide that is here on the board, even though this research was actually done in 2015. Does anybody remember what happened in the summer of 2015? And feel free to answer this now and not save the answer to the Q&A. Anyone? Okay, so 2015, summer 2015 was Operation Protective Edge. And Israel was pretty much in a war.
I'm sorry, 2014. I wonder.
2014?
Yes.
Okay, I'll be corrected. It's fine. I accept it. So Operation Protective Edge, and what we see is this survey. Yeah, you're right. This survey was done in 2015. I stand corrected. So this survey was done in 2015 after the Operation Protective Edge, and still the investor confidence in Israel is just not affected by the geopolitical situation. The investors don't care if a war's happening, if other things are happening. And again, we'll talk about Corona later and its impact on the Israeli market. Some insights, I hope. Obviously, it's still early to say. But people trust Israel's innovation tech ecosystem, even when a war is happening. They don't see a strong connection between the two. Another interesting phenomena here in Israel, that it's a B2B nation. If we look at different business models that are developed, most of the innovation here in Israel is B2B solutions. And one of the great reasons for that is the small market. Israel cannot be B2C because the market here is so small. It's not the US where you have millions and millions of people to to go and market your product to. So pretty much any entrepreneur from day one needs to think global. And one of the ways to do that is to start marketing directly to businesses instead of to customers, because it's much easier to create business relations with all of the multinationals that come here looking for those types of innovation. So as a new startup, you're more likely to sell your product to a big med company rather to a small person who's looking to purchase a medical service. Another strategy of what to do with this small market and not really anywhere to grow here in Israel is doing an IPO. And Israel actually has over time over 250 companies that have gone on NASDAQ, which is the highest number of a foreign country ever. At the moment, there's 92 companies on NASDAQ that are Israeli owned. And their aggregated market is 94 billion. And again, pretty amazing numbers for a country, for only 300,000 people working in high tech. Now, I'll just say, a lot of those companies start here in Israel, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, wherever that is, and then end up opening a second branch in San Francisco, in LA, in New York, wherever it is. So a lot of those companies do have presence in the US, but their IPO is still Israeli. The last strategy is the exit, which is pretty much every entrepreneur's dream, or used to be, because we do see a lot more companies today actually wanting to mature and grow and do an IPO because they understand the value of, being a unicorn and being appreciated and growing as a company. So Orcam is a great example for that. SimilarWeb is another great example of the unicorns here, Lightrix. But one of the strategies is also to be purchased and to sell your company to a different large company, usually globally. And that's actually another interesting way for foreign MNCs to get a foot into the Israeli ecosystem. So for example, Intel that purchased Mobileye, which is the largest exit in Israel's history, $15.3 billion, decided that Mobileye in Jerusalem will be its global center for autonomous driving. So now Intel has a very strong foothold here in Jerusalem. Facebook did the same with a few companies. Apple did the same with other companies. Google did the same with Waze. And we really see that as their foot in the door. And once they purchase one or two companies, they usually start a strong R&D center here. Because Israel really is a strong R&D center globally. And just, we used to have all the 330 multinationals on this slide, and it was kind of an eye test of who can recognize the most small little icons. We took a lot of them off. But having multinationals here is not for granted. Because usually a multinational goes and opens a branch, for example, in a place like Ireland, where it's an access to a whole market, to the entire Europe. They go, to Dubai, and they go into the Middle East. Israel is really isolated. It's not an access point for any of these markets. So why do they come here? They come here for the talent. They come for the innovation. Because once Israel really became the startup nation, everybody wanted to get a piece of it. And everybody wanted to know, how do we also continue to harvest that type of innovation? And when they come here and they get the graduates from the Army, from 8,200 and 8,400 units, when they get the talent coming out of the Technion and the Hebrew University, they too have access to that type of innovation. And in a second, we'll talk about, what makes the Israelis so innovative. But having so many multinationals is really, rare in a small country like ours. They have just a little bit about multinationals, very versatile business model that they work here. Most of them have R&D centers, but some of them create partnerships. So they would create a partnership with an Israeli company. So they won't acquire it, but they would become a customer and create a partnership in that sort of way. And then they would kind of have a, different way of operating and entering the ecosystem. A lot of them also have, a scout on the ground or someone here doing investment, visit here, 5 to 10 times a year to visit those companies that they're interested in. We'll talk about it more later. So how did Israel become the startup nation that it is? Because it wasn't always that. And when we researched it, and a lot of what the story that I'm telling you is based on the book Startup Nation, is that innovation happens in Israel out of a need, an existential need. And in a second, I'll show you some example. And out of that need, people had to think creatively, and people had to come with innovative solutions. And once those solutions were tested, and once those solutions were tried out here in Israel and developed, they could actually have a global outreach. And that's pretty much the story of any Israeli innovation. And if we look at water, for example, okay, water was always an issue in Israel. Those of you who have been to Israel, I don't know, 5+ years ago, have seen the commercials of, Israel's drying out. There was a woman with her face on TV, and her face was crackling because it was the desert and she was drying out. And today, Israel actually has no water problem. And one of the reasons for that is because we are the strongest country with desalinization of seawater today. And once we had that need, people started to understand that we need to think creatively. We can't sit here and wait for the rains to come and fill our reservoirs and the Sea of Galilee. We have to think out of the box to think how to solve that. We also can't count on our neighbors. We also had a few water crises, with Syria and Lebanon with the Jordan River. So we really had to be creative to solve that challenge. And from that creativity, comes a really amazing innovation. And those of you who know Netafem company, Netafem is a drip irrigation company that came out of Israel and today is really doing incredible work worldwide. And one of the reasons that company started is because they started at a kibbutz in the Negev, and there was not enough water there for agriculture. And they said, okay, how can we use less water and get the same results? And they started testing and trying and developed the drip irrigation system, which today is really used across the world and especially in developing countries to help them sustain water and create more sustainable agriculture. Oh, I had it. I wasn't sure if I kept it in. Okay. So the key ingredients for Israeli innovations are 3. One of them is actually immigration. Israel is home to people that come from so many different countries. And, people used to think of diversity as an obstacle, as something that, there used to be a thought of Israel that everybody needed to go through the melting pot to become one type of Sabra Jew, new Israeli. And actually today, the diversity is valued because it inspires also creativity. Different people from different places think differently. And especially if we look at the Russian immigration, it really helped grow that innovative mindset because they came here with a lot of education, PhDs, doctors in all kinds of different fields, but they didn't know the language. So they couldn't find jobs that were high paying or that were suitable for them. And a lot of them started playing with okay, I don't want to be, I don't want to be a cleaner. So what will I do? And started companies in the 90s. Another one is the military service. And I mentioned the 8,200, the 8,400 units, but it's also the leadership you develop and that state of mind. When I was 19, I was an officer in the Army. I was in charge of 60 people. And I managed the entire educational efforts of the Army in 2 cities. And, anywhere in the world, a 19-year-old kid would get that kind of responsibility. And that really builds your character from a very young age. So when you go to study, you already know who you are. Your character is already kind of shaped. And the last component is really the government. And the government, you know, in the early 90s started something called the Yosma Group. And today I told you about the Israeli Innovation Authority, has been a supporter of innovation from day one. And that really helped move all of these companies forward, especially from a seed stage, and especially when those companies are medical or pharma and have much more expenses in R&D. I mean, a medical company can have, before it's even, you know, has its first prototype, can have 5 years of R&D before it can even start going to investors. So we talked about the components of the state, but now let's talk about the components of the people, the characteristics of the people in Israel. And I'm sure, you know, you're very familiar with everything. Everybody's, I'm sure, familiar with the Israeli chutzpah in a good or bad way. I apologize for any bad way, of course. But it's not only that, it's also, you know, the okay to fail. And it's interesting, actually, because in the Arab Israeli sector today, we see a lot less entrepreneurs. And one of the reasons is they're less okay with failing. If someone's successful, they want them to be successful. They want them to be a doctor or a lawyer. They don't get what it means yet to be an entrepreneur. But here in Israel, there's something like, okay, you failed. It's actually celebrated. I don't know if it happens all over the world, but we have an event called Fuck Up Nights, where people go on stage and share their worst failure with the crowd. And it's usually very successful people, so don't feel bad for them. And they share what they learned from that failure. And failure is actually celebrated here because nobody succeeds without failing. If you succeeded, you must have failed before. It's also about risk taking. It's also about, you know, the tachlis, the in practice. Everybody's like, cut to the chase. Like, what do you want? You want money? Ask me for money. You want to be part of it? Tell me you want to be part of it. Like, don't walk around the point. And it's also that lack of hierarchy, which is interesting because we are, you know, everybody goes through the army, but because everybody almost goes through the army, everybody kind of starts on an equal ground, you know, when they go to school, and everybody feels like a friend. You know, you go anywhere in Israel, there's, you know, in the Jewish world, they say there's like 5 degrees of separation. In Israel, there's like 1 or 2 degrees of separation. You know, you'll hardly go to a party and you'll say, I'm from Jerusalem. Oh, do you know so-and-so? And the chances is the second person they're going to ask, you're going to know them. And that's also the ease of access. So just kind of to conclude, you know, the landscape of Israel, there's 6,500 startups today in Israel, 180 VCs and investors, about 80 accelerators, startup accelerators that do training for accelerators from usually from an early stage, some from a later stage, 24 incubators. Now, incubators are also government owned, and they also take equity. That's the main difference between an incubator and an accelerator. About 330 multinationals, 17 TTOs, which are tech transfer organizations that actually help to commercialize IP that is developed inside universities and bring it to the companies that are looking to advance exactly those technologies, and 9 public universities. So to conclude, very small market, a lot of technological, you know, talent developed through all the different pipelines, and a very vibrant ecosystem that really supports people. Now, again, I'm gonna talk a few more minutes about us and what we do. So we host a lot of multinational corporations for this. Multinational corporations, governments, and NGO leaders, C-level only, so only principals and decision makers here in Israel. We work with them a long time, about 2-3 months, on identifying their pain points and what are their needs. And then once they come to Israel, it used to be physically, now we do a lot of it online because creativity is key in these days. They come to Israel and we introduce them to all these different companies in the pain points that they need to solve. So it could actually be a medical company that their biggest pain point is storage and storing medical equipment. It could be a surgery company that's looking for the next innovative surgery robot. It could be so many different things, and they're usually not looking for only one solution. They're usually looking for a few. Again, we were inspired by the book Startup Nation that was written 8 years ago here in Israel. And we're nonprofit, we're non-revenue, so we don't charge for any of our services, and we don't take any money from the government. And the reason we do all those is to stay neutral. So we don't represent any side in any of these dynamics. We don't represent neither the companies here in Israel or the clients abroad. We're really non-biased to all of them and really want just to connect them. But again, we measure ourselves by the impact it has on Israel. So we connect to the world, we strengthen Israeli innovation ecosystem, and the last thing that we do is research. And we have a website called Startup Nation Finder, which is basically a large database that you can all access. It's free of charge, and it has all of the data that I just shared with you online. So each one of the 6,500 companies is registered on our website. All of the investors, all of the TTOs, a lot of the communities as well. We have a lot of startup communities. And this is basically, we see it as an access point. So if you're not a multinational, or if you're still exploring, or if you just want to see what exists out there, you can go into the website, you can put any tag that you want. And I mean, it's a very complex data system. So you can say, I'm looking for a company in the medical field that does B2B solutions, that was founded at least 5 years ago, because I know it takes now 5 years to develop any solution, and it's located in Jerusalem. And you'll get the list of all of those companies. You can also open a profile there, so whatever, you can save the information. And again, it's free of charge. It's our service. And we actually go around the world and help other countries and regions develop these type of Finder, we call it Global Finder, these type of platforms for their own ecosystem. So in Michigan, for example, we're in close contact. We're working with Texas, with New Zealand. We just signed an agreement with Taiwan, Sao Paulo, Brazil. So very, very diverse and really all over. Okay, so I'm actually going to skip the digital health, and I'm going to go straight into COVID-19 because I want to save some time for our Q&A. So Yael asked me to talk a little bit about COVID-19, and when she did, I said, listen, Yael, it's really too early to know anything, because we know it has an impact, but we still don't know what the long-term impact is. But I gathered a few interesting insights and ideas and things that we're working on that I thought could interest you. So one of the things that we saw in COVID that, again, we connect the dots, and we saw that people are looking all over for innovative solution and innovation around remote screening, mass screening, any type of medical care that's not done physically, and any diagnostic technologies that exist out there. We also saw a lot of companies that were pivoting and changing what they were doing. One of those companies is a small company that I know called ULabs. And ULabs does ultrasound-based blood tests. But suddenly they realized during COVID that exactly what they do could actually be used in a different variation of it to test for COVID-19. So we see a lot of companies that had one product and then said, hey, I can actually adjust and be very relevant for these times. And we saw that, the companies that did so have actually been very successful, because part of the thing of being a startup is being able to think on your feet and pivot and not being stuck. There's an entrepreneur, that one of the founders of Waze, actually, Uri Levine, a really amazing guy, that says you need to fall in love with the problem, not with your solution. And the people that were able to identify the problem and adjust their solution to the problem are those who are succeeding. And last, it's about mental health and wellness. And it's not talked about enough today in this world, but mental health and loneliness are a really big problem. There's actually a VC here in Israel, Joy Ventures, that focuses solely on mental health issues. They work with academic research and they build companies to support that. And one of the events that we hosted at SNC was about the future of health, and one of the subjects was really mental health. So that's on the demand side. But what was the impact? So we've seen a few things happening. So as I said, remember the number 8.3 billion, because that was the number that was invested in 2019. And everybody's saying, you know, there's a shortage of investors. People are not going to invest now. COVID-19, you can't travel, you can't meet the company. But there was $5.2 billion invested in Israel in the first half of 2020, which is kind of unbelievable to grasp, because you're like, wait, like almost half of the year, like nothing went down, it only went up. And what we see is that it's actually in companies that are very relevant for the time. And there was actually also a very successful IPO from Jerusalem. It started here in Jerusalem, called Vroom, that doubled its value within 24 hours, you know, on NASDAQ, because it was so relevant for the time. They're automotive. They buy your used car. They take whatever, you know, they buy it at market price. They take care of all the fixing, everything, and they sell it. And you don't need to meet anybody or go anywhere. So obviously, you know, during lockdown and COVID-19, nobody wants to go anywhere. Nobody wants to meet people. So even though there is an anticipated funding shortage, it's really early to say, and it really depends what company you're in. We are seeing that a lot of companies are, you know, reducing their portfolios and taking out the companies that are less successful and investing more resources and more time in the companies that they think have more chances to succeed. So less new investments, but they're strengthening the investments that they already have that they believe in, because they don't want them to close. We have also seen a massive hiring freeze, also some layoffs. I think we're going to see more of that, but again, still early to say. And we see that across the Israeli market. It's also very opportunistic. So people actually got the opportunity. I just heard the former CEO of the Ministry of Health speak, and he said the government did a really big mistake because it gave people the opportunity to stop employment relationships without any penalty, which usually takes a lot more time. And during COVID, they said, okay, everybody's staying at home, we'll give you unemployment. So a lot of people took advantage of that to do anyway layoffs that they wanted to do, but they just did it a lot more quickly and a lot more massively. We do anticipate, you know, having long-term effects, but we still don't know what they are. There's definitely going to be an effect on funding, because as I said, 80% of the money is coming from abroad, and all of these investors cannot come to Israel, cannot meet new companies, and that definitely has a toll. But we still don't know what's going to happen long term. And I mean, if you follow the ecosystem news, you see a lot of M&As happen recently. So I'm going to end with two things that we're doing during Corona as Startup Nation Central. One of them is that we started a website called Corona Tech Israel. And this website is basically the Startup Nation Finder meets Corona. And it maps all the Israeli companies that have COVID-19 solutions in all the different fields. It also offers investing opportunities. It also has a call for challenges. We do PR for those firms. So for example, we launched a really big campaign just last week for all Israeli companies that have COVID-19 solutions. And we're going to go and connect them to global companies. And then, so we're actively promoting them around the world. And we also continue on mapping the online needs, what is needed to give answers to COVID, and where can we bring value. And we continue hosting all these online engagements and online webinars to expose the world to the technology coming here from Israel. Now, of course, all of this, we all know that numbers in Israel are going, are rising. It's not to say that we've beat COVID-19 or anything like that. It's just to say that in Israel, a lot of technological tools exist that can help us, deal with it, and hopefully, at the end of this road, win. Also, definitely a lot of vaccines, and whoever wants to learn more can go to Corona Tech Israel. Again, open, free of charge. And that was it. That was me. I'd be really happy to hear your questions, anything that I've said or anything that you find relevant. So please.
Thank you, Inbal. So do we have questions?
I opened the chat, but everybody just said they heard me, which is great.
Well, I just want to say thank you. It was a really great presentation.
Thank you, Michael. Where are you from?
Florida.
Florida. Numbers are spiking there too?
Yep.
What is 8200, 8400? I assume it's an Army thing.
Yes. So they're both Army units, technological units around cybersecurity and data science. So what happens is that entrepreneurs enter the Army, or not entrepreneurs, sorry. Youth enters the Army when they're 18, usually studied computers, but not always. You go through a series of all kinds of different technological tests to test how able are you to learn a new skill. And then the Army trains them. And at the end of the day, they come out of the Army and they're the most agile and technological advanced people. And I remember one of my friends was in that kind of unit, and he came out of the Army and he found a job without studying college at all, nothing, for really it was 25,000 shekels a month. And I looked at him and I'm like, what did you even do? But he was in the Army for 4 years and he learned all these skills, and those skills are, it takes a long time to learn them. And the Army really invests in the soldiers that go into these units. So they're considered, really elite units. And there's actually some accelerators that came out from those units that train today different types of entrepreneurs. One of them does actually a program for Arab Israelis that didn't go to the Army, and helps train them in those type of skills as well.
Cool.
Which is also very cool. The program's called Hybrid. How about the language? Is it easy to get along with English? It's very easy. Let's see who asked it. Okay, it's very easy to get along in Israel knowing only English. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know. But I think, and my husband would probably agree, that you can't be fully, Israeli without speaking Hebrew. Because in order to really understand the culture and how people, what they're saying, subtext of it, and not just the words, it's also, it's really important to learn Hebrew. It's not that hard. It's not that easy either. Like every language, it takes hard work. But I would say that most Israelis have pretty good English. And even, if you start talking with a little bit of an American accent in Hebrew, they'll answer immediately in English. They'll be like, you're from America. I want to talk English, and we'll switch to English immediately.
Except cab drivers.
What?
Except cab drivers.
Yes, except cab drivers.
Everyone else will speak to you in English. Try to speak to them in Hebrew.
But even cab drivers today know more English, because it's really there's so many tourists here and there's so many Olim in Israel that it's really, it became essential. Yael, that's a question to you. Do you have Upan in the plan?
Yes, Ulpan is included for all participants of the program.
Oh, what is
Ulpan is a class. It's basically a special course to study Hebrew. Ulpan is a word in Hebrew. So that's a fair question.
Okay. Oh, great then, because the only thing I know how to say is bli harif.
It's
That's
important.
a very useful, yeah, very important.
Save
I
me.
see that we have more specific questions regarding Masatek, regarding the age and Ulpan. So let's see if we have a few more questions for Inbal, and then maybe we can take a few of these questions. Any other question for Inbal regarding the Israeli ecosystem?
Did the when you talked about the unemployment during COVID, it's also including tech? Because
It's including tech. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we've seen in the first wave of quarantine, we've seen that nearly 25% of all tech employees were sent home, but that does not mean layoffs.
Okay.
In Israel, there's a term called halat, which is a non-paid vacation. And that's where I said the government probably made a strategic mistake, because they enabled all organizations to send all employees on a non-paid vacation and get money from the government. And once employment status is changed, it's really hard to reestablish it. Now, we do see, some layoffs and some hiring freeze, but we also see massive hiring from different companies that are succeeding, now more than ever. One of the companies, Auto Lead Star, a Jerusalem-based automotive company that helps digitize big corporations, big automotive corporations in the States, actually, but all over the world, but mainly in the US, said, we used to need to convince our customers to go digital. And suddenly all of the customers came to us and said, hey, what do I do? How do I go digital? How do I create a website? How do I automate my sales when there's no physical sales? So a lot of industries really benefited from COVID-19. A lot of industries like, obviously tourism has suffered a lot. But at the same time, ed tech is on the rise, and people are developing really creative solutions of, how education and how schools will look in the future, and how communication will look in the future. Zoom's a great example. I mean, I think professionally, a lot of people use Zoom, but not everybody knew what it is. And now, like, every grandmother across the world knows what Zoom is. And I think that's the type of technologies that are really on the rise. I'll just say one more word about employment, even though that's not the subject. We do a human capital report every year, and we did our 2019 report. Obviously, it doesn't have any reference to COVID-19 in it, but there is a shortage of 18,000 people, again, in 2019 in the Israeli high-tech sector, which means there are great opportunities for people that are trained and have skills to join the tech force and the tech world. And I would say about 70% of these positions are in proper technological positions, and 30 are in more, everything that's surrounding it, marketing, HR, communications, etc. But there really are great opportunities here in Israel for professionals that have skills. There's also a lot of boot camps on the ground. So, a lot of people come here. There's a program called Gvahim that I'm sure when you're in Israel and if you make Aliyah, you'll hear of, that's helping Olim get into tech positions and gain skills. The ecosystem is a very supportive ecosystem. And we like to say that about Jerusalem compared to Tel Aviv, but it's also true generally to Israel. People like helping one another. And one person's success is all of our success. And that's part of the small ecosystem. It's also very friendly. It also really helps one another. So good luck, everyone, unless there's any other question. last question. I'd be happy to take if anybody has.
Yes, can I?
Yeah, Maxim.
Hi all, I'm from Ukraine. Thank you, Inval, for your presentation. It's maybe the best startup related presentation I ever seen. About statistics, about interesting, about companies. It's really helpful. So from your experience, maybe it's too abstract, but maybe you can get me to the point. My first step, I'm going to go to Israel. My first step after I have startup and I want to be successful. What is my first steps? What are my first steps?
Well, it's a complicated question because there are so many steps. It's unfortunately there is no one step to take. I think what I quoted Uri Levine with what he said, which is fall in love with the problem, not with the solution. I think that is probably the best first step that you can make, is understand what's the problem you want to solve in the world, and then develop your solution. Once you develop the solutions, there are so many steps. You need to establish the technology. You need to do R&D. You want to, make sure that you copyright it. You want to go through an accelerator. You want to meet investors. You want to raise seed money so you can go through it. I really think that if you have an idea and if you have a technology, I would highly recommend to join a startup accelerator. And I think the accelerators are probably the best way to get acquainted with the Israeli ecosystem and the various steps that you need to take in order to build a company. And it really helps entrepreneurs kind of organize the entire process of building a company and gain access to really, really amazing mentors and professionals around it. There's a great support system in each accelerator. Some are more global, some are more sector focused, but I would say that would probably be the first step after you've done so many other steps.
I understand. Thank you.
But I would say, Maxim, that in your case, the first step it's obviously arriving in Israel.
True.
Sure.
Yes, it's a huge problem.
Yeah, and I will say, so I'll just wish good luck to all of you, in your journey. I know life is very different than you expected it to be at this time for all of us. So I hope you get here quickly and safely and easily. And I hope you're healthy and you take care of yourselves, because that's the most important thing. All the rest can wait. And thank you so much, Yael.
Thank you, Inbal, so much. Friends, I want to share with you this screen. Please tell me that you see my screen with all the emails. You see it?
Yeah.
You can see. Okay, great. And I'm also sending it to you via the chat. Feel free to reach out either to Ilya, Gregory, or myself if you have any question regarding the program itself, because I saw that in the chat you had a few questions about the age limit and about the Masa grants. So you can just shoot us an email and we'll answer all of your questions. Best of luck to you all, and we'll reach out to you with the invitation to our next webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, you as well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.